History whispers tales of justice served not through the thunder of many guns, but through the lightning of one. In the lawless expanse of New Mexico Territory, 1875, they say there lived a man whose hands could harvest wheat as skillfully as they could draw iron. Some claim it's just another tall tale, born in the heat of desert campfires. But those who witnessed the events that unfolded in Redemption Valley that fateful autumn, they know the truth of what happens when violent men mistake gentleness for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Redemption Valley barely warranted a spot on any map, just another struggling settlement carved from the harsh New Mexico Badlands. A single dusty road meandered past weather-beaten homesteads, connecting a modest general store, a whitewashed church that had seen better days, and the Eagle's Nest Saloon, the only watering hole for 30 miles in any direction. The land was brutal, unrelenting, but beneath its sun-scorched surface lay something worth fighting for: water. Natural springs fed the valley year-round, making it a rare jewel in a desert crown, the kind of place that could make a man prosperous if he knew how to work it, or dead if the wrong people took notice. Miss Eleanor Steeleye Hawkins, who'd run the general store since her husband passed in '68, remembered the day everything changed with the clarity of a desert morning. It was late spring, when the heat hadn't yet turned murderous and hope still danced on the horizon like a mirage. The store's bell chimed, and in walked a stranger leading a well-kept mule laden with farming implements. He wasn't the sort to draw attention. Average height, plain clothes that had seen honest wear, the kind of face that blended into any crowd. But Eleanor hadn't survived 27 years on the frontier by taking things at face value. There was something about this stranger that made her instincts sharpen like a hawk spotting movement in the scrubland. "Name's Thomas Grace," he said, voice soft as desert sand, purchasing supplies with careful consideration. His hands caught her attention first. They were strong, sure, but they moved with an unusual grace that seemed at odds with the calluses. He'd clearly acquired recently, and his eyes, they had that peculiar way of taking in everything while appearing to look at nothing, always knowing where every person stood, every exit lay. She'd seen eyes like that before, back when her late husband rode with the Texas Rangers. Grace bought Martinez's abandoned plot on the valley's eastern edge, the one most folks said was too close to Apache territory to farm safely. Paid in silver, dollars, kept to himself, and started working that supposedly dangerous land with a precision that made even lifelong farmers pause and watch. Every morning before the sun branded the sky, he'd be out there, methodically clearing rocks, measuring rows with unusual exactness, setting fence posts with the careful attention of a man marking distances for something far more important than farming. The valley held its share of secrets in those days, and plenty of reasons to keep them. The water in Redemption Valley wasn't just good, it was salvation. In a territory where drought could spell death, natural springs that flowed year-round were worth more than gold. But that kind of wealth drew attention, and attention was the last thing the valley needed with the Scorpion riders pushing north through the territory. Gabriel Rattler Reyes had started small, just another outlaw, with a fast gun and bigger dreams. But he was smarter than most, and realized that true power wasn't in quick raids and stolen horses, but in controlling the water itself. He'd already taken 3 valleys to the south, using a mixture of intimidation, arson, and lead to convince ranchers to sell their water rights for pennies on the dollar. Those who refused had a habit of vanishing, their homes mysteriously burning on moonless nights. The Hawkins family knew better than most what Reyes was capable of. Eleanor's brother James had been sheriff in Promise Valley before the Scorpion. Riders moved in. He tried to organize resistance, unite the ranchers against Reyes's pressure. They found him one morning in his own jail cell, shot through both hands before the killing shot, his badge replaced with a scorpion carved from copper. Reyes's signature, they said. Nobody paid much mind to Thomas Grace in those early days. He was just another farmer trying to coax life from stubborn earth. No one noticed how he'd sometimes pause in his work, head cocked just so, like he was listening for something far beyond normal hearing, or how his eyes would track riders passing on the road with the same careful attention he gave to plotting his furrows. Even when he came to town for supplies, he moved quiet as a shadow, watching, listening, and learning the valley's rhythms. Young Jamie Hawkins, Eleanor's 12-year-old son, was probably the first to suspect something wasn't quite what it seemed. With the new farmer, Jamie was sharp as a cactus spine and twice as nosy, had taken to watching Grace's farm from the hills above, fascinated by the stranger's methodical ways. One morning he saw something that set his mind spinning. Grace was mending a fence when a diamondback rattler struck at him from the rocks. Without seeming to look, without even changing expression, Grace's hand moved. The snake fell dead, its head nearly severed by a thrown fence staple. It was the kind of move that shouldn't have been possible, too fast, too precise, like his hand knew where it needed to be before his mind gave the command. But that's getting ahead of the story. First, you need to understand what Redemption Valley was before the storm broke. Before a single farmer showed the whole territory that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't the gun a man carries openly, but the skill he keeps hidden behind quiet words and honest work. You need to understand what it means when a man who's spent his life perfecting the art of the draw decides instead to pursue the art of making things grow, and what happens when violent men mistake that choice for weakness. As spring burned into summer, dark clouds gathered over Redemption Valley, though not a drop of rain fell from the New Mexico sky. Word of the Scorpion Rider's approach spread through the settlement like wildfire in drought season. They started, subtle, the way a rattler tests its ground before striking. First came the scouts, just passing through, they said, asking casual questions about water rights and property boundaries. They'd stop at the Eagle's Nest, loose with their money and freer with their threats, bragging about what happened to folks down south who didn't know how to be reasonable. Sheriff Marcus Wade watched it all from his office, worry etching deeper lines around his eyes. He was a good man, folks said, but good wasn't always enough against the kind of evil riding toward their valley. He'd known James Hawkins, seen what happened when a lawman stood alone against Reyes's pack. His badge felt heavier with each passing day, like it was cast from lead instead of tin. The first real trouble came at Davidson Place. Samuel Davidson was a proud man, worked his spread for 15 years, raised 4 children on that land. One morning he found his irrigation channel blocked, the precious water diverted away from his crops. When he went to clear it, 3 riders appeared, casual as you please, guns riding low on their hips. Shame about the water, one said, cleaning his nails with a knife. Lot of accidents happening lately. Of course, Mr. Reyes is offering fair prices for water rights. Better to sell than watch everything you built just dry up and blow away. Davidson had no choice. He sold for 1/3 of what the water rights were worth, packed his family in their wagon, and headed east. Others followed, the Turners, the Rodriguezes, the Clayton family with their prized horses. Each sale came with a story of accidents that couldn't be proven, of midnight visits and morning devastation. Through it all, Thomas Grace kept working his plot on the eastern edge, seemingly absorbed in his endless task of clearing fields and tending crops. But Eleanor Hawkins noticed how his hands would tighten on his tools when Reyes's men rode past, like they were something else entirely. She caught him one evening as he was buying supplies, his usual order of seeds and tools. "Have you heard about the Davidsons?" she asked, measuring out coffee beans with practiced precision. "Hard not to," Grace replied, his voice soft as ever, but with something underneath it like steel wrapped in silk. "Reyes's men were in here earlier, asking about you, about your water rights." Grace's smile didn't change, but something in his eyes did. "Were they now? And what did you tell them, Miss Hawkins? That you're just another fool trying to farm Apache territory?" She paused, then added lower, "But you're not, are you?" For a long moment Grace said nothing, just studied her with those two sharp eyes. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes, Miss Hawkins, the best way to protect something isn't to fight for it, but to grow it, to nurture it until it's strong enough to stand on its own." That night, young Jamie Hawkins couldn't sleep. He snuck out to his watching spot in the hills above Grace's farm, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious farmer's strange abilities. What he saw would stay with him for years to come. Grace wasn't farming. He was practicing. In the pale moonlight, his hands would occasionally drift to his hip where no gun hung, moving with a fluid grace that made Jamie's breath catch. Every motion was precise, deliberate, like a dance learned so well it had become part of him. When a coyote's howl split the night, Grace's hand moved faster than Jamie's eyes could follow, drawing and firing an imaginary gun in one smooth motion. The boy had seen plenty of gunslingers pass through Redemption Valley, but none moved like that. This was something else entirely, the kind of speed that turned legend into truth. Jamie ran home through the darkness, his mind racing with what he'd seen. But by morning everything had changed. The Reynolds family's well had been poisoned, their cattle dying of thirst. Reyes's men were getting bolder, and Redemption Valley's time was running out. Sheriff Wade called a town meeting in the church the next day. "Reyes isn't just coming for water rights anymore," he announced to the gathered faces. "Word is he's aiming to make an example of us, show the whole territory what happens to folks who take too long to see things his way." Thomas Grace stood at the back of the church, quiet as always, but Eleanor noticed how his eyes tracked every reaction, every whispered conversation. He was measuring something, she realized. Not distances this time, but resolve. The meeting ended, with more questions than answers, but as the townspeople filed out, Eleanor caught Grace's arm. "There's something else you're not telling us," she said. "Something about why you really came here." Grace studied her for a long moment. "Been following Reyes's pattern for a while now," he finally admitted. "Valley to valley, always the same. But this time," he looked out toward his farm, where the evening sun painted the fields gold. "This time, he's riding into more than he knows." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor's breath caught as realization dawned. "You chose this valley on purpose. You were waiting for him." Grace's smile held no humor. "Sometimes, Ms. Hawkins, the best trap is the one your enemy walks into thinking it's his own idea." As darkness fell over Redemption Valley, more riders were spotted heading north. The Scorpion Riders were coming in force, and Gabriel "Rattler" Reyes himself was leading them. What none of them knew was that a quiet farmer with calloused hands and a gunfighter's grace had been preparing for their arrival longer than anyone suspected. The war for Redemption Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Not even Reyes, with all his cunning, could have guessed that his greatest enemy would turn out to be a man who had traded his gun belt for a plow, or at least appeared to. Gabriel "Rattler" Reyes rode into Redemption Valley at sunset 3, days after the Reynolds well was poisoned. He didn't arrive with guns blazing or a show of force. Instead, he came like a businessman, well dressed in an elegant black coat, a silver scorpion pinned to his lapel, with just 6 riders flanking him. But there was nothing civilized about the fear that rippled through town at his approach, or the way his eyes seemed to measure everything and everyone in terms of profit and pain. Eleanor Hawkins watched from her store window as Reyes dismounted outside the Eagle's Nest saloon. He moved with the coiled readiness of a snake, preparing to strike. His gun belt worn high and tight in the Chihuahua style, not a showman's rig, but a killer's tool. The copper scorpion medallion he wore caught the dying sunlight, a reminder of the fate that had befallen her brother. "Quite the welcome," Reyes remarked, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. The Spanish lilt in his words did nothing to soften their edge. You'd think folks had never seen honest businessmen looking to invest in their community before. The laugh that followed held no warmth, like wind through a boneyard. Sheriff Wade emerged from his office, badge gleaming but his hand notably away from his gun. Smart man. Reyes's riders had already spread out, taking positions that gave them clear lines of fire across the street. "Mr. Reyes," Wade said, his voice steady despite the tension, "we weren't expecting you." "Best kind of visit, wouldn't you say?" Reyes' smile never reached his eyes. "Keeps things honest. I hear you've got some of the finest water rights in the territory. Shame to see them worked by folks who don't have the resources to make the most of them." The exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Grace, driving his mule-drawn wagon loaded with farming supplies. He seemed oblivious to the tension, to the way Reyes's men had their hands near their guns. He simply guided his wagon through, the crowd nodding politely to those he passed. Reyes's attention snapped to the newcomer like a rattler sensing movement. "Don't believe we've met," he called out. "Gabriel Reyes, at your service. I'm looking to invest in local water rights, build something special here in Redemption Valley." Grace secured his mule before turning, his movements unhurried. "Thomas." "Grace," he replied simply, "just a farmer trying to grow something worthwhile." But Eleanor, watching from her doorway, saw how he positioned himself, subtle, almost unconscious, but putting him in perfect view of all Reyes's men while keeping the setting sun at his back. It was the kind of positioning she'd seen gunfighters use, though most weren't nearly as subtle about it. "Farmer." Reyes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard about your place up east. Apache territory, bad water. Can't be easy making a living out there." "Good things rarely come easy, Mr. Reyes." Grace's voice remained mild, but something in his tone made Reyes's closest rider shift uneasily in his saddle. "True enough, but life's full of opportunities if you know where to look. My associates, and I might be interested in taking that burden off your hands. Fair price, of course." Grace seemed to consider this, head tilted slightly as if listening to distant music. "Appreciate the offer," he said finally, "but I've put down roots. Hard thing to do in rocky soil, makes you reluctant to pull them up." The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Reyes's smile became a razor's edge. "Roots can wither mighty quick in this climate. Seen it happen too many times. Man's better off taking a fair offer while it's on the table." "Maybe," Grace began unloading his supplies, his movements precise and measured, "but I've always believed that anything worth having is worth fighting for. Whether it's crops pushing through stone or men standing their ground." Before Reyes could respond, commotion erupted from the south end of town. A rider was coming in fast, one of Reyes's scouts, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He dismounted in a rush, whispering urgently in his boss's ear. Whatever news he brought caused Reyes's face to darken like a thunderhead. "We'll continue this discussion later," Reyes said, his casual tone belied by the tension in his shoulders. He turned to Wade. "Sheriff, you might want to ride out to Mitchell Place. Seems there's been another unfortunate accident." As Reyes and his men rode south, Eleanor hurried to where Grace still stood, calmly unloading his wagon. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met," she said quietly, "or the biggest fool." Grace's hands never paused in their work. "There's a third option, Miss Hawkins." His voice was soft, meant for her ears alone. "Sometimes a man chooses his ground carefully, knowing exactly what's coming and how to meet it." Young Jamie, who had been watching everything from his perch on the store's porch, suddenly spoke up. "I saw you last night, Mr. Grace. Saw how you move when you think no one's watching. Saw you practicing." Grace turned to the boy, something like sadness crossing his features. "And what exactly did you see, Jamie?" "Those weren't farming moves." Jamie's voice dropped to a whisper. "The way your hand moves to your hip, the way you stand. My uncle used to move like that before the scorpions got him. You're a gunfighter." "Smart boy," Grace nodded. "Too smart to go spreading stories, I hope, at least until the right time." Eleanor grabbed her grandson's shoulder protectively. "What are you really, Mr. Grace?" Grace secured the last of his supplies before answering. "Just a man who learned long ago that there are two ways to deal with snakes. You can hunt them, track them, try to kill them one by one. Or you can build something they can't poison, gather good people together, make a stand that matters." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, Ms. Hawkins." "Jamie." Sheriff Wade approached as Grace's wagon headed east. His face was grim. "Mitchell, place is burning," he said without preamble. "Old man Mitchell tried to stand up to them. He couldn't finish. Eleanor's hand went to her throat where she kept her brother's spare badge on a chain. "Marcus," she said, using the sheriff's first name for the first time in years, "what are we going to do?" Wade watched Grace's wagon disappearing toward the eastern edge of the valley. "Maybe nothing," he said thoughtfully. "That new farmer of yours, something familiar about him. Way he moves, way he takes in everything. Reminds me of stories I heard during the border wars about a gunfighter. Never knew his real name, but they called him Ghost Hand Grace because of how fast he could draw. They say he once took down 6 men in the time it takes to blink." "You think our farmer is this Ghost Hand?" "I think Reyes just picked a fight without knowing who he's really fighting. And I think things in Redemption Valley are about to get real interesting." As if to punctuate his words, a sound rang out from the eastern edge of the valley. Not a gunshot, but the clear ring of a hammer striking metal. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a measurement of things to come. The war for Redemption Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Not even Reyes, with all his reputation for cunning, could have guessed that his greatest enemy would turn out to be a man who seemed to spend more time checking his crops than his gun. But then that's what happens when you mistake a rattlesnake. Hunter for prey. The next day dawned blood-red over Redemption Valley, the sun struggling through dust, kicked up by more riders arriving through the night. Reyes's message couldn't have been clearer: resist and burn. But something else was happening in the valley, something that made even his hardened gunmen nervous. It started with the accidents. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. 2 of Reyes's men were scouting near Grace's farm when their horses suddenly spooked, throwing them hard enough to crack ribs. They swore they'd heard nothing, seen nothing, just a flash of metal from the distant rocks that had startled their mounts. Another rider, carrying threats to reluctant farmers, found his path blocked by fallen cactus and suspicious rock slides. Each obstacle seemed random, natural even, but they all had one thing in common. They'd been prepared days in advance, just waiting for the right moment. Eleanor Hawkins was counting inventory when Grace came in for his weekly supplies. His list had changed. Less seed and farming tools, more rope, wire, and oddly specific amounts of mining supplies. "Planning on doing some blasting?" she asked casually, wrapping the packages. "Lot of rocks still in that field of yours?" "Something like that," Grace smiled, but his eyes were focused elsewhere, watching Reyes's latest recruits drinking across the street at the Eagle's Nest. Though sometimes the best way to move a boulder isn't to break it, but to make it roll where you want it to go. "Smart boy," Grace nodded. "Too smart to go spreading stories, I hope, at least until the right time." Eleanor grabbed her grandson's shoulder protectively. "What are you really, Mr. Grace?" Grace secured the last of his supplies before answering. "Just a man who learned long ago that there are 2 ways to deal with snakes. You can hunt them, track them, Try to kill them one by one. Or you can build something they can't poison, gather good people together, make a stand that matters. He touched the brim of his hat. Good day, Ms. Hawkins. Jamie. Sheriff Wade approached as Grace's wagon headed east. His face was grim. Mitchell. Place is burning, he said without preamble. Old man Mitchell tried to stand up to them. He couldn't finish. Eleanor's hand went to her throat where she kept her brother's spare badge on a chain. Marcus, she said, using the sheriff's first name for the first time in years, what are we going to do? Wade watched Grace's wagon disappearing toward the eastern edge of the valley. Maybe nothing, he said thoughtfully. That new farmer of yours, something familiar about him, way he moves, way he takes in everything. Reminds me of stories I heard during the border wars about a gunfighter. Never knew his real name, but they called him Ghost Hand Grace because of how fast he could draw. They say he once took down 6 men in the time it takes to blink. You think our farmer is this Ghost Hand? I think Reyes just picked a fight without knowing who he's really fighting. And I think things in Redemption Valley are about to get real interesting. As if to punctuate his words, a sound rang out from the eastern edge of the valley. Not a gunshot, but the clear ring of a hammer striking metal. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a measurement of things to come. The war for Redemption Valley was about to begin, though not in the way anyone expected. Not even Reyes, with all his reputation for cunning, could have guessed that his greatest enemy would turn out to be a man who seemed to spend more time checking his crops than his gun. But then that's what happens when you mistake a rattlesnake. Hunter for prey. The next day dawned blood-red over Redemption Valley, the sun struggling through dust, kicked up by more riders arriving through the night. Reyes's message couldn't have been clearer: resist and burn. But something else was happening in the valley, something that made even his hardened gunmen nervous. It started with the accidents. Small things at first, easy to dismiss. 2 of Reyes's men were scouting near Grace's farm when their horses suddenly spooked, throwing them hard enough to crack ribs. They swore they'd heard nothing, seen nothing, just a flash of metal from the distant rocks that had startled their mounts. Another rider, carrying threats to reluctant farmers, found his path blocked by fallen cactus and suspicious rock slides. Each obstacle seemed random, natural even, but they all had one thing in common. They'd been prepared days in advance, just waiting for the right moment. Eleanor Hawkins was counting inventory when Grace came in for his weekly supplies. His list had changed. Less seed and farming tools, more rope, wire, and oddly specific amounts of mining supplies. Planning on doing some blasting, she asked casually, wrapping the packages. Lot of rocks still in that field of yours? Something like that, Grace smiled, but his eyes were focused elsewhere, watching Reyes's latest recruits drinking across the street at the Eagle's Nest. Though sometimes the best way to move a boulder isn't to break it, but to make it roll where you want it to go. Before Eleanor could respond, Jamie burst into the store, out of breath and wide-eyed. Mr. Grace, they're saying Miguel Reyes is coming, Gabriel's brother, the one they call the Scorpion's Sting. They say he's even faster with a gun than his brother. Grace's reaction was subtle, just a slight tightening around his eyes, but Eleanor caught it. Miguel Reyes, he said softly. Now that's interesting timing. You know of him? Eleanor asked, though something in Grace's tone suggested more than mere knowledge. We've met. Grace's hand unconsciously touched his right side, where Eleanor glimpsed the edge of an old scar through his worn shirt. 3 years ago, down in Sonora, he was terrorizing mining towns there too, until someone stopped him. Someone. Jamie leaned in, hungry for details. A ghost, they said. A gunfighter who could draw and fire before most men could blink. Never saw him coming, just heard the explosion of gunpowder and watched their best guns fall. Grace's voice had changed, become distant like he was reading from a memory. Miguel lost the use of his gun hand that day, and his taste for fair fights started sending others to do his killing for him. Eleanor's mind was racing, connecting pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. That's why you chose this valley, isn't it? Why you spent months preparing your farm? You knew they were coming. Grace nodded slowly. Been tracking the Reyes brothers for 3 years, watching their pattern. They always move the same way. Start with the outer settlements, work their way to the richest water sources. Redemption Valley was next on their list, just had to wait. Wait for what? Jamie asked. For them to think they had the upper hand, for them to get careless. Grace gathered his supplies. Miguel Reyes is cautious now, won't move unless he thinks. He has every advantage. But his brother Gabriel, pride makes him take risks, especially when he thinks he's dealing with simple farmers. As if on cue, shouting erupted from the street. 2 of Reyes's men were roughing up Old Man Turner, whose cattle had mysteriously survived the poisoned well. Turner's son Daniel came running to help, only to be pistol-whipped to the ground. Sheriff Wade emerged from his office, but Reyes's the men had him covered. Grace didn't move, didn't even seem to be watching, but his voice carried an edge Eleanor hadn't heard before. Jamie, remember that cave where you've been watching my farm? The one with the lightning-split mesquite? Jamie nodded eagerly. There's a package there wrapped in oilcloth. Bring it to your grandmother after dark, and Jamie... Grace's eyes locked with the boys. Don't let anyone see you. As darkness fell, Jamie returned with a heavy bundle. Inside, Eleanor found a gun belt, unlike any she'd seen before. The holster was worn smooth as silk, custom-fitted for a specific weapon. But it was the gun itself that took her breath away. A Colt single-action army, its blued steel dark as night, modified with a smoothness that spoke of a master gunsmith's touch. There was also a letter, written in Grace's precise hand. Ms. Hawkins, what's coming isn't just about stopping the Reyes brothers. It's about showing good people they can stand against evil, that fear isn't the only way. I've spent months preparing. This valley, escape routes, defensive positions, places where one gun can stop 20 men, but a gun's just a tool. What matters is the hands it falls into and the hearts of the people it protects. The sheriff's a good man, but he needs to know he's not standing alone. Show him this gun. Show him there's a plan. And when the time comes, show him there are still people willing to fight for what's right. The next morning, Miguel Reyes rode into Redemption Valley with 12 hard men at his back. He was easy to spot, right hand twisted into a useless claw, face carved with hate. His first stop was Grace's farm, but he found only empty fields and carefully tended rows. No sign of the farmer, though the morning coffee pot was still warm on the stove. Miguel didn't like it. Something about the setup felt familiar. Tickled old memories he'd rather forget, the precise arrangement of the buildings, the clear lines of sight to every approach. He'd seen work like this before, paid for it with his gun hand. Spread out, he ordered his men. Check every building, every field, find him. That's when the first shot rang out. The shot that rang out across Redemption Valley didn't kill anyone, wasn't meant to. Instead, the bullet kicked up dust exactly 1 inch from Miguel Reyes's boots, spraying his polished leather with desert. Sand. The message was crystal clear. The next one wouldn't miss. The scorpion's sting stood frozen, his crippled hand clutching reflexively at his gun belt as 2 more shots cracked out in rapid succession, each kicking up dirt closer than the last. His men were already diving for cover, but Grace had spent months preparing this battlefield. Every natural hiding spot had been subtly altered. Boulders that appeared solid were carefully balanced to shift under weight. Clusters of cacti had been trimmed to offer less protection than they seemed to promise, and even the innocent-looking irrigation ditches had been dug at angles that would force men to expose themselves to fire. "Scatter!" Miguel bellowed, but that's exactly what Grace had been waiting for. As the riders broke in different directions, more shots rang out, not just from one position, but from multiple points around the farm. Some were simple mechanical tricks, carefully placed rifles with triggers set to trip wires. But each shot was precisely aimed to drive Reyes's men exactly where Grace wanted them. In town, Gabriel Reyes burst out of the eagle's nest at the sound of gunfire, his own, men scrambling to mount up. But Sheriff Wade was waiting in his office doorway, badge gleaming, Grace's modified Colt hanging low on his hip. "Wouldn't do that if I were you," he said calmly. Behind him stood a dozen townspeople, armed and determined. Eleanor Hawkins's voice rang out from her store's upper window, where she held her brother's old Winchester with practiced ease. "You've got enough trouble at your brother's position," she called down. "Might want to think carefully about opening a second front." Reyes's face darkened with rage. "You really think a few farmers with rusty rifles can stop me? I own 3 valleys south of here, and every man in them knows what happens to those who stand against the Scorpion Riders." "You own nothing," came a new voice. Old Man Turner stepped forward, his face still bruised from yesterday's beating. "You steal, you poison, you murder, but you don't own anything except fear, and we're done being afraid." Back at Grace's farm, Miguel Reyes and his remaining men had been herded into a natural basin between 2 rock formations. Every time they tried to break out, precise shots would drive them back. Not killing shots, something worse. Shots that proved the shooter could end them any time he wanted, was choosing not to just to prove his control. "Show yourself!" Miguel screamed, firing wildly at the surrounding rocks, his twisted hand making his aim erratic. "Face me like a man, like you faced me in Sonora." Grace's voice carried clearly across the morning air, though no one could spot his position. "Like you faced those miners. Like you faced their families when you poisoned their wells." Another shot cracked out, taking Miguel's hat clean off his head. The Scorpion's sting dropped to his knees, his gun falling from trembling fingers. "We can deal," he shouted. "Whatever you want, money, land, name it." "What I want," Grace's voice was closer now, though still hidden, "is for you to carry a message to every other snake thinking of slithering into this territory. Tell them about today. Tell them what happened when you thought you found easy prey and instead found a hunter." In town, Gabriel Reyes was quickly running out of options. More townspeople were emerging from their homes, armed and purposeful. He recognized faces, men and women whose water rights he'd stolen, whose lives he'd ruined in other valleys. They'd followed him here, drawn by word of Grace's stand, ready to reclaim what was taken. "This is bigger than one valley now," Sheriff Wade said quietly. "Word spread about what's happening here. Every community you terrorized, every family you drove out. They're all watching, all waiting to see if one town can break the Scorpions." "Grip!" Reyes's hand twitched toward his gun. "You really ready to die for this worthless dirt?" "No one's dying today." The voice rang out clear as a church bell. Thomas Grace stood in the middle of the street, 30 paces from Reyes. No one had seen him move into position, hadn't heard a sound, like a ghost. The farmer's clothes were dusty from the morning's work, but he stood with a stillness that made every gunman on the street hold their breath. This wasn't the humble farmer who'd spent months tending his crops. This was Ghost Hand Grace, the fastest gun in the territory, the man who'd put down Miguel Reyes in Sonora. "No one's dying," Grace repeated, his voice soft but carrying to every. "Unless you make it necessary." For the first time, real fear showed in Gabriel Reyes's eyes. Grace's stance, his voice, the way his right hand hung relaxed at his side. This was no farmer playing at resistance. This was a predator who had lured his prey exactly where he wanted them. "Last chance," Grace continued. "Ride out. Leave the territory. Never come back, or find out why they called me Ghost Hand." Reyes looked around wildly at the armed townspeople, at his brother's men trapped in the distance, at the mysterious gunfighter who had orchestrated it all. His empire of fear was crumbling, and he knew it. At that moment, Gabriel Rattler Reyes made his final mistake. He drew. What happened next became legend in Redemption Valley. Those who saw it swore Grace never seemed to move, never seemed to aim. There was just the explosion of his Colt and Reyes's gun flying from his hand, a perfect shot that left him alive but ended any threat he posed. In the distance, similar shots rang out, disarming the remainder of his men with surgical precision. The war for Redemption Valley was over, ending not with a massacre, but with a demonstration of such skill that it left no doubt about what could have happened if Grace had chosen to kill rather than warn Jamie Hawkins. Watching from his mother's store, saw something else in that moment. Saw the way Grace's hand moved, faster than human eyes could follow. It wasn't just speed, though that was remarkable enough. It was the perfect fusion of mind and muscle, of preparation and execution. Every motion had been planned months in advance, every angle calculated, every possible reaction accounted for. As Reyes's men were rounded up, Eleanor approached Grace. "You could have ended this the day you arrived," she said. "Why the wait? Why all the preparation?" Grace holstered his Colt with the same careful precision he used when planting seeds. "Because some things need to grow," he said, looking out. Over the valley where his crops were starting to show green, take root, become stronger than any one person. As if to prove his point, wagons were already rolling into Redemption Valley, families returning. The Davidsons, the Turners, all those who'd been driven out. But they weren't alone. With them came others, drawn by the story of how one small valley had broken the back of the territory's most feared outlaws. Sheriff Wade found Grace later that day as the afternoon sun painted the desert in shades of gold. "Finally remembered where I'd heard about Ghost Hand," he said, settling on Grace's fence. "Army records from after the war with Mexico. They say you could have written your own ticket. Any marshal's badge, any railroad security job, you name it." Grace nodded slowly. "They offered good money, important work. But I'd seen enough killing by then, seen what violence does to both sides of any fight. Started thinking maybe the best way to stop evil isn't just to shoot it, but to give good people the courage to stand against it. That's why all this?" Wade gestured at the carefully tended fields, the precise arrangements that had turned a humble farm into a tactical masterpiece. "Farming teaches you patience," Grace smiled. "Shows you that the most important victories are the ones that take time to grow. I needed Reyes to see me as harmless, needed time to prepare the ground, both literally and figuratively. But more than that, I needed the valley to remember its own strength." Young Jamie Cooper came running up, excitement written across his face. "Mr. Grace, they found Reyes's ledgers in his saddlebags, all the proof of their crimes, every stolen water right. The territorial judge is riding in tomorrow to start setting things right." Grace's smile deepened. "Justice grows best in fertile soil, Jamie. Remember that." As weeks passed, Redemption Valley began to transform. The returning families brought new energy, new determination. Grace's farm became a gathering place, not just for those wanting to learn about agriculture, but for anyone seeking to understand how one man's patient courage had changed everything. Late one evening, as the desert wind painted the valley with the scent of sage and promise, Eleanor finally asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Why here? Of all the places the Reyes brothers terrorized, why choose Redemption Valley to make your stand? Grace was silent for a long moment, cleaning his Colt with the same care he showed his farming tools. "During the border wars," he said finally, "I learned that the best position for a gunfighter isn't always the highest ground. It's the place where everything comes together. Terrain, timing, purpose." Redemption Valley wasn't just another target for the Scorpion Riders. It was the keystone of their empire. Taking it would have given them control of all the surrounding water sources. He paused, checking his gun's action with practiced precision. But it was more than that. This valley, it's like the land itself wants to grow something good. The water, the soil, the people. Now we plant different seeds. Grace stood, looking out over his fields, where the evening light painted everything in shades of promise. Seeds of justice, of community, of standing together against whatever darkness comes. The Reyes brothers won't be the last snakes to eye this territory, but next time they won't find scattered prey. They'll find shepherds who know how to protect their own. As if to prove his words, the valley continued to flourish. The territorial governor, impressed by how one community had broken the Scorpion Rider's grip, established a regional marshal's office in Redemption Valley. Wade took the position, with Grace quietly teaching him and his deputies the arts of patience and preparation that had proven so effective. But Grace himself refused all offers of badges or official positions. He had his farm to tend, he said, and sometimes the best way to protect something wasn't from a position of authority, but from the ground up, nurturing it like a tender shoot until it grew strong enough to weather any storm. They say on quiet. Evenings you can still find him on his porch, his colt clean and ready, but rarely needed now. He watches over his fields and the valley beyond, not as ghost hand Grace who haunted Sonora, but as the farmer who showed an entire territory that the strongest power comes not from fear, but from courage, planted in fertile soil and tended with patient hands. The story of Redemption Valley and the gunfighter who became a farmer still echoes through these parts, not just as a tale of how one man's speed with a gun broke an empire of evil, but as a reminder that the most important victories are the ones we grow together, standing tall like desert flowers after the rain, ready to face whatever storms may come. And if sometimes, when trouble threatens the peace of neighboring valleys, ranchers report seeing a familiar figure watching from distant ridges, colt at his side, will some ghosts choose to linger, protecting the good things they've helped to grow. Winter came early to Redemption Valley that year, bringing with it whispers of trouble from the south. The Reyes brothers were gone, but nature abhors a vacuum, and other predators had taken notice of how one small valley had brought down an empire. Among them was Jackson Blackjack Hawthorne, a man who'd made his fortune in the California goldfields through means that made even the Scorpion Riders look gentle. Word reached Grace one bitter morning as he was checking his winter wheat. Marshal Wade, still adjusting to his new badge, rode up with news that made the veteran gunfighter's eyes narrow. Hawthorne's men have been asking questions in Copper Canyon, Wade reported, his breath frosting in the cold air. About you specifically. About what really happened here. Grace continued his inspection, though Eleanor Hawkins, watching from her store porch, noticed how his movements had changed, become more measured, more precise. The farmer was fading, the gunfighter emerging once again. Interesting timing, Grace mused, studying a wheat sprout with careful attention. Just as the mountain passes is about to close with snow. That's not all. Wade hesitated, then pressed on. They say he's bringing something new. Gatling guns, 3 of them. This got Grace's full attention. The rapid-fire weapons could change everything, make his carefully prepared defensive positions worthless. But there was something in his eyes, not fear, but the calm calculation that had served him so well before. You know what most men don't understand about machines like that, Marcus? Grace asked, examining another wheat sprout with careful attention. They think more bullets means more power. But a Gatling gun is just like any other weapon. It's only as good as its position, its timing, and the man using it. Eleanor approached, her face tight with worry. Even you can't outshoot a Gatling gun, Thomas. No, Grace agreed, but I don't have to. Sometimes the best way to defeat a weapon isn't to fight it, but to make it useless. He turned to Wade, Ride up to the old mission ruins behind the burnt chapel. You'll find a cache of supplies I laid in months ago. Bring back the brass spyglass and the mining maps." As Wade rode off, Eleanor confronted Grace directly. "You knew. Something like this would happen, didn't you? Even after the Reyes brothers, you kept preparing." Grace's smile held no humor. "Peace is like farming, Ms. Hawkins. You don't just plant once and expect crops forever. You have to tend to it, protect it, and be ready for the storms that come." He looked south toward the mountain passes. "Hawthorne's not like Reyes. He doesn't want to own the valley. He wants to destroy it, make an example of what happens to those who resist men like him." That evening, Marshal Wade called a town meeting in the church. The community that gathered was different from the frightened settlers of 6 months ago. These were people who had stood against terror and won, who had learned that courage, like fear, could spread if given fertile ground. "Hawthorne's coming," Wade announced simply, "and he's coming for blood. Those Gatling guns can tear this town apart." "Then we stand again," Old Man Turner declared, his voice firm. "Grace showed us how last time." But Grace, standing quietly at the back of the church, shook his head. "Not like last time. This needs to be different. Hawthorne's expecting a gunfighter's tricks, expecting me to try to pick off his men from hiding." His eyes held that distant look that meant he was seeing things others couldn't. "So we give him something else entirely." "You're not building barriers," she realized, watching him sight along a timberline. "You're building something else." "Hawthorne thinks he knows what he's facing," Grace replied quietly. "Thinks he's learned from Reyes's mistakes. But there's an old saying among gunfighters: the target you see isn't always the target that matters." As the first snow began to fall, Redemption Valley prepared for war once again. But this time, under Grace's guidance, they were preparing for a very different kind of fight. Ghost Hand Grace had one more lesson to teach about the nature of patience, preparation, and the true meaning of strength. And in the frozen passes to the south, Blackjack Hawthorne was about to learn why some legends are best left undisturbed. 3 days of snowfall transformed Redemption Valley into something otherworldly, a landscape of white broken only by the dark shapes of Grace's mysterious constructions. To untrained eyes, they looked like madness, wooden frames and stone piles, arranged in patterns that made no obvious sense. But Sarah Cooper had learned to see beyond the obvious where Thomas Grace was concerned. She found him at dawn, checking measurements with the brass spyglass Wade had retrieved. The instrument wasn't a military issue. It was something else, something more precise. Like everything about Grace, it had a purpose beyond the obvious. "That's not just for spotting, is it?" she asked, offering him coffee. Grace adjusted the spyglass settings with practiced care. "It's a surveyor's transit. Spent 2 years with the railroad, learning how to map terrain, calculate grades and angles." He smiled slightly. "Useful skills. For a gunfighter, even more useful for what's coming." "And what exactly is coming?" The question came from Marshal Wade, approaching through the knee-deep snow. "Because right now all I see is a lot of timber and stone, placed where it won't stop a single bullet from those Gatling guns." "That's because they're not meant to stop bullets." Grace's voice held that quiet certainty that had come to mean trouble for his enemies. "They're meant to direct them. Every frame, every stone pile, they're like the banks of a river, channeling water where you want it to go." Understanding dawned in Wade's eyes. "You're creating killing grounds." "No." Grace's denial was sharp. "I'm creating choice points. Places where Hawthorne and his men will have to make decisions, and in weather like this, with limited visibility," he gestured at the swirling snow, "they'll make the choices I want them to make." The day brought more preparations, but not the kind anyone expected. Instead of digging defensive positions, Grace had the townspeople spread hay and straw in specific places, creating paths that looked like natural routes through the snow. Each path led past his wooden constructions, past piles of stone that seemed randomly placed. Jamie Hawkins, watching from his favorite observation point, began to see the pattern. "It's like a maze," he said excitedly, "but one you can't see until you're in it." "Smart boy," Grace nodded approvingly. "In a snowstorm, men follow the path of least resistance. They'll take what looks like natural cover, move along the easiest routes. And those routes lead right where you want them," Jamie finished. "But what about the Gatling guns?" Eleanor asked, joining them. Grace's smile held a predator's edge. "A Gatling gun is just a complicated way of throwing lead. And like anything complicated, it has weaknesses. Weight, limited mobility in deep snow, fixed firing positions. But its biggest weakness," he pointed to the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains, "visibility. A Gatling gun is useless if you can't see what you're shooting at." That afternoon, Hawthorne's scouts were spotted checking the passes. They were careful, professional, but they saw exactly what Grace wanted them to see: a town preparing typical defenses, seemingly unaware of the devastating power of rapid-fire weapons. "Let them look," Grace instructed, when some of the townspeople wanted to drive the scouts off. "Let them think they know what they're facing." Eleanor found him that evening in his barn, methodically checking his Colt. But he was also preparing something else. Small metal canisters with carefully measured fuses. "Mining charges?" she asked, surprised. "Sometimes," Grace replied, working the action of his revolver with practiced smoothness. "The best trap isn't the one you set, but the one your enemy sets for himself. Every man has patterns, habits. Hawthorne's known for using Gatling guns to pin down his targets while his men move in for the kill. He'll expect us to hunker down, try to weather the storm of bullets, but that's not your plan. A gunfighter's greatest asset isn't his speed." Grace held up one of the metal canisters, studying it in the lamplight. "It's his ability to control the battlefield, to shape it, to know every angle, every distance, every choice his opponent will face." As night fell, more news arrived. Hawthorne's main force was moving through the passes, using the storm for cover. They had the Gatling guns hauled on specially designed sleds, but they also had something else, something that made Grace's eyes narrow when he heard about it. "Explosive shells," Jamie reported breathlessly, "for the Gatling guns. They're saying Hawthorne plans to make an example of Redemption Valley, not just defeat us, destroy us completely." Grace absorbed this information with his usual calm, but those who knew him saw the subtle changes, the way he checked his gear with extra care, the stillness that came over him. Not the stillness of fear, but of a predator preparing to strike. "Good," he said finally, surprising everyone. "Let them bring their explosives. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy brings to the fight." That night, as the storm intensified, Grace gathered the town's defenders in the church. The plan he laid out was unlike anything they expected. No heroic last stands, no dramatic gunfights from distant ridges. Instead, he spoke of timing, of pressure points, of how fear and limited visibility could turn a superior force's strength against itself. "Tomorrow," he concluded, "Hawthorne will learn what Reyes learned, that Redemption Valley isn't just land worth fighting for, it's land worth thinking for, ground worth planning for, and most importantly, his eyes met each defender in turn. It's home to people worth protecting by any means necessary." As the defenders dispersed to their positions, Eleanor caught Grace's arm. "You're not telling us everything, are you? There's more to your plan." "There always is, Ms. Hawkins." Grace checked the chambers of his Colt one final time. But sometimes the best plan is the one your own people can't reveal, even under pressure. The night deepened, the storm howling like a pack of wolves scenting blood. Somewhere in that swirling white darkness, Hawthorne's forces were moving into position, confident in their superior firepower and explosive arsenal. But they were moving into a battlefield shaped by a master of angles and distances, a man who had spent months preparing for this moment. The next part of our story will reveal just how deep Grace's planning went, and how one man's patient genius could turn even the most powerful weapons against those who wielded them. Dawn never really came to Redemption Valley that morning, just a gradual lightening of the storm's darkness to a ghostly grey. The snow fell in thick curtains, reducing visibility to mere yards, transforming familiar shapes into looming shadows. Perfect weather for an attack, most would say, but Grace had been counting on exactly this kind of day. The first sign of Hawthorne's advance came as a deep rumbling through the frozen ground, the sound of heavy sleds carrying the Gatling guns through the swirling snow. Dark figures emerged, moving exactly as Grace had predicted, following the paths of least resistance that he'd so carefully prepared. "Right on schedule," Grace murmured from his position near the church steeple. He wasn't using his spyglass in this weather. Eyes alone worked better. Besides, he'd memorized every distance, every angle months ago. Jamie signaled the south ridge. Young Hawkins raised a lantern 3 times, its light diffused by the snow into a ghostly glow. Moments later, an answering flash came from where Turner and his men waited. Everything was in position. Hawthorne's men moved with professional precision, securing what looked like advantageous positions among Grace's wooden constructions. The Gatling guns were placed exactly where any military commander would put them, on slight rises, offering clear fields of fire toward the town, or what seemed like clear fields. "They're deploying the explosive shells," Jamie reported, watching through the brass spyglass. 4 men to each gun, just like you said they would. Grace nodded, checking his Colt one last time. Confident men make predictable choices. Hawthorne thinks he's learned from Reyes's mistake, thinks overwhelming firepower is the answer to a skilled gunfighter. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He hasn't learned the right lesson. The attack began with theatrical flourish. Jackson Blackjack Hawthorne himself rode forward through the snow, his signature black duster stark against the white landscape. His voice boomed across the valley, practiced and pompous. "To the people of Redemption Valley, you've earned a reputation for resistance, for harboring a man who thinks himself clever enough to stand against progress. I'm here to teach you the cost of such pride." As if to punctuate his words, all 3 Gatling guns opened fire, their savage drumbeat echoing off the mountains. Hundreds of explosive shells chewed through the snow, detonating against wood and stone. But Grace's careful preparations proved their worth. Most of the explosions were caught by hidden earthworks or deflected by precisely angled timber frames. "Time to introduce some variables," Grace said calmly. He fired a single shot, not at any person, but at a specific stone pile on the valley's eastern edge. The impact dislodged a carefully balanced rock, which tumbled down, triggering a cascade. The resulting avalanche wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. The thundering snow and rock sent Hawthorne's men scrambling for new cover, exactly the positions Grace had prepared for them. "They're splitting up," Jamie observed, "just like you said they would." Grace was already moving, ghost-like, through the storm. Fear makes men predictable. When faced with danger from above, they'll seek solid cover below. Marshal Wade's voice crackled through the wind. "Ready when you are." The next phase began, with another single shot from Grace, this one striking a concealed cache of mining charges near one of the Gatling gun positions. The explosion wasn't large, but in the swirling snow it seemed massive. More importantly, it sprayed frozen debris across the snow, creating a wall of ice crystals that further reduced visibility. Hawthorne's men, already nervous, began firing wildly at shadows. The Gatling guns roared again, but in the chaos and limited visibility, their explosive shells might as well have been fireworks, all sound and fury, signifying nothing. Meanwhile, Grace's carefully placed townspeople began their part, firing from multiple positions, creating the illusion of a much larger force. The sound of gunfire seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere in the swirling snow. "You're using their own weapons against them," Eleanor realized, watching from the church tower. The snow, the explosives, even the terror of the Gatling guns. "Every weapon has two edges," Grace replied, moving to a new position with fluid. Grace. A Gatling gun is fearsome when you can see your target. In a snowstorm, with careful preparation. He gestured at the chaos below. It becomes a source of fear for those using it. The battle reached its crescendo as Hawthorne's ammunition teams, desperate to resupply their guns, found themselves caught in Grace's invisible maze. Paths that seemed to lead to the guns actually circled back, bringing them under fire from their own explosive shells. Through it all, Grace moved like his old namesake, a ghost in the storm, appearing and disappearing, each shot precise and purposeful. He never aimed to kill, but each bullet drove Hawthorne's men exactly where he wanted them. The turning point came when one of the Gatling gun crews, thoroughly lost and panicked, sought shelter in what appeared to be a stable. Too late, they realized it was one of Grace's carefully prepared positions, and they had just trapped themselves with their own explosive shells. "Surrender now," Grace's voice carried through the storm, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You're surrounded, your weapons are useless, and that stable you're hiding in, the support beam above your heads is rigged to collapse. One shot is all it would take." Hawthorne's rage cut through the howling wind. "Show yourself, you coward! Face me like a man." A man. Grace's voice held something cold. "Men like you understand only one thing: power. So I'm showing you a different kind of power, not the power to destroy, but the power to control. Every move you've made since entering this valley has been exactly what I wanted. Every position you've taken, every shell you've fired, all part of a plan months in the making." As if to prove his point, another series of controlled avalanches cut off Hawthorne's escape routes. His men were now completely boxed in, caught in a trap so subtle they hadn't even realized it was closing until too late. The end, when it came, was surprisingly quiet. No dramatic final shootout, no heroic charges, just the gradual realization by Hawthorne's men that they were utterly outmaneuvered, caught in a web of somebody else's design. But Grace wasn't done. He had one final lesson to teach about the true nature of power and justice, a lesson that would ensure Redemption Valley's peace for generations to come. As the morning sun finally broke through the storm clouds, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and crimson, Grace approached the trapped Hawthorne with an unexpected proposal. "You have a choice," Grace said, his voice carrying across the pristine morning air. "One that's more generous than you offered others." He stood before Hawthorne, his Colt holstered but ready. "You can face territorial justice for your crimes, and believe me, we have enough witnesses now to ensure that happens, or you can become something more valuable, a messenger." Hawthorne, his black duster now stained white with snow and defeat, sneered. "A messenger of what? Of consequence?" Grace replied simply, "The truth about what really happened here. Not just about how one gunfighter outmaneuvered your entire force, but about how one community stood together and proved that all your fancy weapons, all your explosive shells, mean nothing against people who know how to think, how to prepare, how to stand their ground." Eleanor, watching from nearby, saw something she'd never expected. Grace was offering not just mercy, but purpose. He wasn't just ending a fight. He was transforming an enemy into a tool for peace. "Why should I carry your message?" Hawthorne demanded, though there was something different in his voice now, something almost like respect. "Because you're a student of power," Grace answered. "You've built your reputation on understanding strength, so tell me what's more powerful, the fact that I could have killed you and your men a dozen times over, or the fact that I chose not to? Your Gatling guns that now lie useless in the snow, or the strategy that made them worthless?" He gestured at the valley around them, at the intricate network of preparations that had turned a superior force's strength against itself. "You came here expecting to find one gunfighter, one man to defeat. Instead, you found an entire community that had learned to think like a gunfighter, to use patience, preparation, and precision instead of brute force." As if to emphasize his point, the townspeople were already emerging, not with vengeful anger, but with the quiet confidence of those who had learned their own strength. They began dismantling Grace's elaborate constructions, repurposing the materials for rebuilding and growth. "Your reputation will actually help spread the message," Grace continued. "When the notorious Blackjack Hawthorne tells others about how his Gatling guns and explosive shells were defeated not by superior firepower, but by superior thinking, well, that's the kind of story that makes men stop and reconsider their choices." Jamie, now standing proudly beside his mother, understood what Grace was doing. "You're not just protecting Redemption Valley anymore, are you? You're teaching others how to protect themselves." Grace smiled at the boy's insight. "The best victory isn't the one that leaves your enemy destroyed, but transformed, changed in a way that helps others change too." In the days that followed, Hawthorne did indeed become a messenger, though not in the way anyone expected. He stayed in Redemption Valley, not as a prisoner, but as a student. Grace taught him not just about gunfighting and strategy, but about the deeper principles that had transformed a simple valley into something extraordinary. "Power isn't just about who has the biggest guns," Grace explained one evening as they surveyed the valley from his porch. "It's about understanding the terrain, both the physical landscape and the landscape of human nature. It's about knowing when to shoot and when to grow something instead." The spring that followed brought more than just new crops to Redemption Valley. It brought visitors, lawmen, community leaders, and yes, even reformed outlaws, all coming to learn from the place where one of the territory's most feared forces had been defeated not by violence, but by patience and preparation. Grace's farm became a different kind of school, though not one that taught traditional subjects. He taught principles, how to read terrain, how to prepare ground, how to build community defenses that didn't rely solely on guns. But most importantly, he taught people how to think like protectors rather than predators. Eleanor, watching all this unfold, finally asked him the question that had been on her mind since the beginning. "You never intended to just save one valley, did you?" Grace looked out over his flourishing fields, where wheat grew in patterns that could still serve as defensive positions if needed, but now primarily yielded bread for a growing community. "During the border wars," he said quietly, "I learned that a gunfighter's greatest skill isn't speed with a gun. It's the ability to see patterns, to understand how small changes can have large effects. I realized the same principle could be applied to fighting evil. Sometimes the best way to stop violence isn't with more violence, but by teaching people how to make violence ineffective." As spring painted Redemption Valley in shades of green and gold, word of what had happened there spread across the territory like wildfire in dry grass. The story grew with each telling, how the legendary ghost hand Grace had turned a simple farm into an invisible fortress, how he'd defeated 3 Gatling guns with nothing but patience and planning, how he'd transformed one of the territory's most notorious outlaws into a teacher of peace. But change, like the desert flowers that bloomed after rain, often draws unexpected attention. The morning trouble rode back into the valley and started peacefully enough. Grace was teaching Jamie the finer points of reading terrain, how to spot natural defensive positions, how to understand the way wind and weather could work for or against you. When Marshal Wade rode up fast, kicking up dust from the newly thawed ground. "Riders coming," he announced without preamble. But not the usual sort. Army officers, looks like. Captain James Wellington and a full company of cavalry. Grace's reaction was subtle, just a slight pause in his movements. But Eleanor, who'd come to know his tales, caught it. "You know them?" "Know of them," Grace replied, his voice carrying that careful neutrality that meant trouble. Wellington was at Fort Davis during the border wars. Man who believes that peace comes from having the biggest guns and the most men to use them. "Why would the army take interest in us now?" Jamie asked, eager to apply his newly learned skills of reading situations. Grace smiled grimly. "Because, son, we've done something more dangerous than beating a few outlaws. We've shown there's another way to handle trouble. Some folks find that more threatening than any gunfighter." Captain Wellington rode into town like he owned it, straight-backed on a gleaming black stallion, 50 cavalrymen at his back. His uniform was parade ground perfect, his brass buttons catching the morning sun. But it was his eyes that Eleanor noticed, cold and calculating, measuring everything in terms of military advantage. "Quite the operation you've got here," Wellington announced, surveying the valley from his saddle. "Word of what happened with Hawthorne's gang has reached all the way to Washington. They're very interested in how one farmer managed to defeat 3 Gatling guns." He spoke the word farmer like it tasted bitter. Grace, standing on his porch, simply nodded in greeting, every bit the humble agriculturist. "No mystery to it, Captain," he replied mildly. "Good people working together, knowing their land, nothing that would interest Washington." Wellington's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, but it does interest them, Mr. Grace. Or should I say, Ghost Hand. The army's been looking for you for quite some time. Your skills could be put to better use than growing wheat." The tension in the air thickened like storm clouds gathering. Eleanor saw how Grace's hand stayed carefully away from his holstered Colt, how he maintained his relaxed posture even as his eyes marked every soldier's position. "I appreciate the offer," Grace said, his voice still calm as summer rain. "But my fighting days are done. These days I prefer to grow things. This isn't an offer, Ghost Hand. This is a requisition of valuable military assets. You, your tactical knowledge, and these fascinating defensive arrangements you've created. The army needs men who can train others in these techniques." Grace's smile remained pleasant, but something shifted in his stance, subtle, almost invisible, but Eleanor had seen it before. It was the same shift that had preceded his lightning-fast draw against Reyes. "Seems to me," Grace replied carefully, "that a man's skills belong to himself, just like a farmer's crops belong to those who planted them." Wellington's face hardened. "These are uncertain times, Grace. The territory needs order, structure. We can't have every settlement taking the law into their own hands, creating their own militias. It sets a dangerous precedent, more dangerous than leaving good people helpless against predators." Grace's question hung in the air like gunsmoke. "The army can handle any threats to legitimate settlements." Wellington's voice carried the weight of official authority. "We're establishing a new fort just south of here. All local defense matters will be handled through proper military channels." Grace studied the captain for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He chuckled. "You still don't understand what really happened here, do you? This was never about fighting. It was about teaching people they don't need to live in fear, that with proper preparation and community spirit, they can protect themselves." That's exactly the kind of dangerous thinking we're here to address. Wellington's hand rested meaningfully on his cavalry saber. The army cannot allow civilians to establish their own power structures outside proper authority. Power structures. Grace's voice held genuine amusement now. "Captain, All we've done here is show people how to farm smart, how to work together, how to use what they have to protect what they love. If that threatens your authority, maybe you should question what kind of authority you're really defending." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of more riders, but these weren't soldiers. They were farmers, ranchers, townspeople from settlements all across the territory. At their head rode Blackjack Hawthorne himself, transformed from the terror of the territory into something else entirely. "Heard there might be trouble brewing," Hawthorne announced, dismounting easily. "Thought we'd come see if our teacher needed any help with his lesson." Wellington's face darkened as more riders appeared on every ridge surrounding the valley. These weren't armed gangs or military units. They were ordinary people, carrying tools more often than guns, but moving with the same quiet confidence Grace had taught them. "What is this?" Wellington demanded. "This," Grace replied softly, "is what real peace looks like, Captain. Not enforced by guns or uniforms, but grown from the ground up. Every person here has learned that the strongest weapon isn't the one that kills best, but the one that protects most effectively." He gestured at his fields, where wheat grew in patterns that could serve as defensive positions, but primarily yielded bread. "You see a dangerous precedent. I see hope taking root. You see power slipping away. I see it flowing to where it truly belongs, in the hands of good people who know how to use it wisely." Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet valley. "When the Reyes brothers came, we were helpless. When Hawthorne came with his Gatling guns, we were ready. Not because we had bigger guns or more fighters, but because Thomas taught us something more valuable than shooting. He taught us how to think, how to prepare, how to stand together." Wellington looked around at the gathering crowd, at the determined faces of people who had learned to protect themselves without losing their humanity. For the first time, uncertainty showed in his expression. "Washington won't like this," he warned. "They'll see it as a threat to established order." "Then maybe," Grace suggested quietly, "you should tell them a different story. Not about a gunfighter teaching people to fight, but about communities learning to prevent violence before it starts. About a new kind of peace, one that doesn't need forts or cavalry to maintain it." The morning after the council meeting, Grace rode out alone toward Dragon's Pass. Eleanor watched him go, noticing how he carried no rifle, no visible weapons beyond his ever-present Colt. But she knew better than most that Thomas Grace's most dangerous weapons had never been the ones he carried openly. "Isn't it risky?" Jamie asked, watching his mentor disappear into the dawn mist. "Going alone like that?" "Your Mr. Grace is never really alone," came a voice from behind them. Standing there was Running Fox, one of the Apache scouts who had become a regular visitor to the valley. "He reads sign like my people, sees what others miss. The land itself speaks to those who know how to listen." The Apache scout's presence was no accident. After the report of the Army patrol attack, Grace had sent messages to both the military and the Apache leaders. Now the valley waited, watching to see how his careful groundwork would bear fruit. "Tell me what you see," Grace had asked Jamie the night before, pointing to the map of Dragon's Pass spread on his table. "It's a natural choke point," Jamie answered, applying the lessons he'd learned. "Only 2 ways through, both easily watched." "Perfect. And place for an ambush. Perfect place for something else too," Grace had replied with that knowing smile. "What do you notice about the timing of the attack?" Jamie's eyes had widened with understanding. The patrol was hit exactly when both army reinforcements and Apache warriors would be too far away to investigate properly. "Smart boy. And what does that tell you?" "That whoever did this wanted both sides to blame each other. I wanted to start a fight." Grace nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like a protector, not a fighter." Sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one pointing a gun at you, but the one whispering in your ear, trying to make you point your gun at someone else. Now, as the morning wore on, more riders arrived in Redemption Valley. From the south came Captain Wellington with a small escort, his face grim, but his manner respectful. He'd learned enough about Grace to know there was always more to any situation than first appeared. From the west came Chief Black Horse of the Apache, accompanied by his most trusted warriors. Eleanor had prepared the church for the meeting, remembering how Grace had once told her that the best negotiations happen on neutral ground, where all parties stand equal. As the territorial leaders gathered, she noticed how Grace had arranged everything beforehand, the seating, the sight lines, even the way sunlight fell through the windows. Nothing was left to chance. Grace himself arrived last, dust on his clothes suggesting he'd been scouting the pass since dawn. He carried a small leather satchel that drew every eye in the room. "Before we begin," he said quietly, his voice carrying that calm authority that had become famous across the territory, "I want to show you what I found at Dragon's Pass." From the satchel he pulled several items, spent cartridge cases, pieces of torn cloth, broken arrow shafts. He laid them out carefully on the table. "Look closely," he invited. "Chief Black Horse, these arrows, are they Apache-made?" The chief examined them with expert eyes. "They are made to look like an Apache," he said finally. "But the fletching is wrong. My people use eagle feathers. These are turkey." Wellington leaned forward. "And these cartridge cases, they're an army issue, but they're not from any recent patrol," Grace finished. "The brass is weathered. These shells were fired months ago, collected and planted at the scene." A murmur ran through the gathered leaders. Grace waited for the implications to sink in before continuing. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to make this look like an Apache raid on an army patrol. They want us to fight each other. But they made mistakes. The kind of mistakes that tell us not just what happened, but who wants us to think it happened." He pulled out a map, pointing to several marked locations. The patrol was attacked here, but tracks lead here, here, and here. Too many directions, too carefully laid. Like someone wanted us to find them, wanted us to follow whichever trail would best lead to war. "Copper interests," Wellington said suddenly. "There's been talk of rich deposits in Dragon's Pass. If the territory erupts in war, they could move in afterward." Black Horse nodded. "Take the land while we weaken each other fighting." Grace smiled grimly. "Now you're thinking like farmers. Instead of fighters, looking at what grows from the seeds someone's trying to plant." Eleanor watched the faces around the table change as understanding dawned. This was Grace's true gift. Not his speed with a gun or his tactical brilliance, but his ability to make others see beyond the obvious, to understand the deeper currents that moved beneath surface events. "So what do we do?" someone asked. "If we do nothing, they'll try again. If we fight, we play into their hands. We do what this valley has learned to do," Grace replied. "We prepare the ground, but not for war, for something they won't expect." He began laying out his plan, and as Eleanor listened, she understood why Ghost Hand Grace had become legendary, not for the men he'd outdrawn, but for the fights he'd prevented before they could begin. The plan was elegantly simple, like all of Grace's best strategies. Instead of armies moving against each other, there would be joint patrols, Apache scouts riding with army troopers, learning each other's ways. Instead of fortified positions, there would be trading posts where all parties could meet in peace. And most importantly, there would be a sharing of knowledge. The Apache's deep understanding of the land, combined with the settlers' farming techniques and the Army's organizational skills. "They expect us to react with fear and anger," Grace explained. "To build walls, draw lines, choose sides. Instead, we'll build bridges, make connections so strong that when they try to break us apart again, they'll find it impossible." "But the copper interests," Wellington pointed out. They won't just give up. Grace's smile held that dangerous edge that reminded everyone he hadn't always been a peaceful farmer. No, they won't. Which is why we're also going to give them exactly what they don't expect, a legitimate way to get what they want. He pulled out another map, this one showing proposed mining sites. The Apache know where the best copper deposits are. The army has the means to protect them. The settlers have the skills to work them. Instead of fighting over the resources, we create a partnership. Everyone benefits. Everyone has a stake in keeping the peace. Black Horse studied the map thoughtfully. My people would still control our ancestral lands, with guaranteed rights and a share of any mining profits, Grace nodded, written into territorial law, witnessed by all parties. Wellington looked skeptical. And you think the mining interests will accept this? They can accept a fair profit, made in peace, or they can try to explain to their investors why they're involved in stirring up a war that's drawing attention from Washington. Men who deal in money usually prefer the quieter option. As the discussion continued, Eleanor saw Grace's deeper strategy unfolding. He wasn't just solving the immediate crisis, he was creating a framework for lasting peace, one built on mutual interest and shared prosperity rather than force and fear. But not everyone was ready to accept such a radical change. As word of the meeting spread, a group of armed men rode into the valley, representatives of the mining interests, led by a sharp-dressed Easterner named Victor Carlton. "This is all very touching," Carlton sneered, barging into the church with his men. "But business doesn't work on handshakes and good intentions. We have legitimate claims to those copper deposits." Grace didn't rise from his seat, didn't reach for his gun. He simply smiled that quiet smile that had become famous across the territory. "Legitimate claims? Like the legitimately planted evidence at Dragon's Pass?" Carlton's face reddened. "I don't know what you're talking about." "No?" Grace pulled another item from his satchel, a torn piece of paper with Carlton's company letterhead found among the planted evidence. "Careless, leaving this behind. Almost as careless as hiring men who don't know the difference between Apache arrows and tourist trinkets. You can't prove anything. Don't need to." Grace's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the softness. "See, while we've been meeting here, riders have been carrying news to every settlement in the territory. Apache scouts and army patrols are already working together. By sundown, everyone will know about the attempted deception. The only question is whether your company wants to be remembered as the villain who tried to start a war, or the pioneer who helped establish a new way of doing business in the territory." Carlton looked around the room, seeing no friendly faces. Even his own men seemed uncomfortable. "What exactly are you proposing?" "The same deal we were discussing before you arrived. Fair prices for mining rights, profit sharing with local communities and tribes, protected rights for all parties. The only difference is, now you'll be doing it in full view of territorial law and public opinion." "And if we refuse?" Grace stood, slowly, and though he made no threatening move, something in his posture reminded everyone that before he was a peacemaker, he had been the fastest gun in the territory. "Then every newspaper from here to Washington will know how your company tried to instigate a war for profit. The army will be obliged to investigate. The Apache will withdraw all access to their lands, and every settler in the territory will know exactly who to blame for stirring up trouble." Jamie, watching from near the door, saw something he'd never noticed before, how his mentor could be more intimidating with words than most men were with guns. Carlton looked like he'd bitten into something sour, but he was a businessman first. He could see which way the wind was blowing. "Perhaps we could discuss terms." As the negotiations proceeded, Eleanor watched Grace carefully orchestrate everything. The seating arrangements, the timing of breaks, even the way different parties were encouraged to share meals together. He was building something more than just a business agreement. "You're making them invest in peace," she realized later that evening, as Grace sat on his porch cleaning his Colt, a habit he maintained even though the gun hadn't been fired in. "Anger for months. People protect what they have a stake in," he replied, checking the revolver's action with practiced care. "Whether it's land, profits, or relationships, the trick isn't to force them to do what's right, but to make doing right the most profitable choice." "And if Carlton or someone else still tries to cause trouble?" Grace smiled, holstering his weapon. "That's why we maintain our preparations, keep our skills sharp. Peace isn't about being defenseless, it's about making violence the least attractive option." As if to prove his point, the next few weeks saw a flurry of activity in the valley. New trading posts were established at key points, jointly operated by settlers, Apache, and Army personnel. Mining surveys began, with mixed teams working together to identify the best sites while preserving sacred and sensitive areas. And through it all, Grace's network of trained observers kept watch, ready to spot and diffuse trouble before it could grow. The story of how Ghost Hand Grace prevented a territory-wide war spread far and wide, though few understood the full scope of what he'd accomplished. They told tales of his cunning in uncovering the plot, but missed how he'd turned enemies into partners. They spoke of his boldness in confronting the mining interests, but missed how he'd created a system where peace became more profitable than conflict. But those who were there, who watched him weave together the interests of different peoples into a stronger whole, understood that his greatest victory wasn't in preventing a war. It was in showing how former enemies could work together to build something better than any could have built alone. As autumn painted the valley in golds and reds, Eleanor found Grace teaching another group of students, not just about defense or farming now, but about the delicate art of building peace. "The fastest gun can only solve one problem at a time," he told them, standing in fields that had once been positioned for battle, but now grew food for 3 different peoples. But an idea, a way of thinking that shows people how to turn conflict into cooperation, that can solve problems for generations to come. Jamie, still his most dedicated student, understood better than most. "That's why you came here, isn't it? Not just to stop the Reyes brothers or Hawthorne, or even this war. You came to plant something that would keep growing long after you were gone." Grace nodded approvingly. "The best legacy isn't in how many fights you win, son. It's in how many you make unnecessary. Remember that." Winter settled over Redemption Valley like a comfortable blanket, bringing with it an unfamiliar peace. The mining operations were running smoothly, with mixed crews of settlers and Apache working together under the watchful but increasingly relaxed eye of Army patrols. Trading posts that had started as neutral meeting grounds were becoming gathering places where different cultures shared stories and skills, but peace has a way of stirring up old ghosts. The morning trouble found Grace, again started quietly enough. He was teaching Jamie advanced tracking techniques in the fresh snow when Eleanor rode up fast from town, her face tight with concern. "Riders coming," she announced without preamble, but not the usual kind. "One of them, Thomas. It's Miguel, Reyes's widow." Grace's reaction was subtle, just a slight stiffening of his shoulders, but Jamie had learned to read his mentor well enough to know that something significant had just shifted. "Maria Reyes," Grace said softly. "Didn't expect her to find me here. You know her?" Jamie asked, eager as always for more pieces of his mentor's mysterious past. "Know her," Grace replied carefully. "Back in Sonora before I shot Miguel, she was known as La Sanadora, the healer. Treated anyone who needed help, didn't care which side of the law they stood on. Even patched me up once, though she didn't know who I was at the time." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "What would bring her here now?" "Nothing good," Grace sighed. "Maria Reyes isn't the kind to seek revenge, but she's also not one to travel this far without serious reason." They rode back to town together, Grace's manner relaxed but his eyes constantly moving, reading signs most wouldn't notice. As they approached, they could see a small group of riders had already reached the main street. 3 women and 2 men, all travel-worn but sitting their horses with the easy grace of experienced riders. Maria Reyes was easy to spot, even for those who'd never seen her. She carried herself with the dignity of a Spanish donna, her black dress and silver-streaked hair marking her as a widow in mourning, but there was steel in her spine and wisdom. In her eyes, "Thomas Grace," she called out as they approached, "or should I say Ghost Hand, we meet again, though this time I know who I'm talking to." Grace dismounted smoothly, touching his hat in respectful greeting. "Mrs. Reyes, you're a long way from Sonora, and you're a long way from the man who shot my husband's gun hand off." Her voice held no bitterness, only a weary sort of understanding. "I hear you've traded your speed with a gun for skill with a plow." "I found it more useful in the long run," Grace replied mildly. "But something tells me you didn't ride all this way to discuss my farming techniques." Maria's face grew grave. "No, I came because what you've built here, this peace you've made between different peoples, it's needed in Sonora. Desperately." She dismounted, her movements showing the fatigue of long travel. Eleanor, ever the gracious hostess, stepped forward to offer support, but Maria waved her off gently. "The cartels are taking over the borderlands," she continued. "Not like the old gangs. These men are organized, ruthless. They don't just want to control territory. They want to own people's souls. They're turning communities against each other, using fear and money to break apart alliances that have held for generations." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you think what we've done here could work there? I think you understand something that others don't, how to turn enemies into allies, how to make peace more profitable than violence. We need that knowledge in Sonora, before it's too late." The request hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Everyone who knew Grace understood what she was really asking, not just for his knowledge, but for him to return to the place where his legend as Ghost Hand had begun. "Sonora's different from here," Grace said carefully. "The cartels aren't like Reyes or Hawthorne. They have deeper roots, darker methods." "Which is why we need more than just a fast gun," Maria replied. "We need someone who knows how to build, something stronger than fear." Jamie stepped forward, unable to contain himself. "You can't ask him to leave. We need him here." Grace turned to his young student with a gentle smile. "Do we? Look around, Jamie. Look at what this valley's become. The trading posts, the mixed patrols, the way different peoples work together. Would any of that stop if I rode south? But your farm, your teachings, are in good hands." Grace's eyes met Eleanor's, then Wade's, who had joined them silently. "Everything I know, I've shared with others who can share it further. That was always the point, not to be needed, but to help others learn to stand strong together." Eleanor understood what was happening. "You knew something like this would come, didn't you? It's why you've been so careful to teach everything you know, to build systems that don't depend on you." Grace nodded slowly. "Peace is like farming, Miss Hawkins. You don't just plant in one field and call it done. Sometimes you have to carry seeds to new ground, especially when that ground desperately needs something better to grow." But before any decision could be made, a commotion erupted at the edge of town. Another rider was approaching fast, and from the way he rode, it was clear he carried urgent news. The next few minutes would change everything, setting in motion events that would test not just Grace's skill with a gun, but everything he had built and taught in Redemption Valley. The fastest gun in the territory was about to face a choice between the peace he had grown and the peace that needed growing, between the community he had built and one crying out for help. In that moment, as Grace watched the rider approach, his hand unconsciously drifting to his Colt, he remembered something he'd told Jamie long ago. Sometimes the hardest part of protecting peace isn't knowing when to fight. It's knowing when and how to let others take up the fight in their own way. The rider reached them, his horse lathered despite the cold. The news he carried would force everyone in Redemption Valley, not just Grace, to decide what they truly believed about the power of peace and the responsibility that comes with knowing and how to build it. Apache riders spotted a large force moving through Shadow Canyon, the messenger reported between breaths. At least 50 men, heavily armed. They're flying the Dead Snake banner. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. The Dead Snake gang was notorious in the borderlands, a mixture of former cartel soldiers and desperate men who had turned to violence as a way of life. They were led by Manuel La Vibora Ortiz, a man whose reputation for cruelty made even the Reyes brothers seem gentle. Maria Reyes's face went pale. They followed us. I didn't think they'd dare come this far north, but they're not just following you, Grace said quietly, his eyes distant as he thought through the implications. They're sending a message, trying to show that no place is beyond their reach, that even the famous peace of Redemption Valley can be broken. Marshal Wade stepped forward. We can get word to the army post. They'd never arrive in time. Grace shook his head. Shadow Canyon's only 4 hours' ride from here, less if they push their horses. Jamie looked up at his mentor eagerly. Then we fight. Show them what happens to anyone who threatens the valley. But Grace was already shaking his head. No, that's exactly what they want. To prove that in the end, violence is the only answer. To destroy not just our people, but the very idea we've built here. Then what do we do? Eleanor asked, though something in her expression suggested she already knew what Grace was thinking. We show them something they've never seen before. Grace turned to the gathered townspeople, his voice carrying that quiet authority that had become legendary. Everyone remember what we learned during the Hawthorne fight? About using the land itself as our ally? Nods all around. Grace continued, Good, because we're about to teach the Dead Snake Gang and anyone else watching the hardest lesson of all, that true strength isn't in having the most guns, but in having the most people working together. The next few hours saw Redemption Valley transform, but not in the way most would expect when preparing for battle. Instead of building barricades or distributing weapons, Grace had the townspeople begin what looked like a massive celebration. Bonfires were lit at carefully chosen points, creating paths of light and shadow. The trading posts became gathering places where Apache scouts mixed with settlers and passing travelers, all sharing food and stories as if it were a normal evening. I don't understand, Maria said, watching the preparations. You're acting as if we don't know they're coming. Grace smiled. That's exactly what we want them to think, but look closer. See how the bonfires are placed. How are people gathering in specific spots? Jamie's eyes widened as he realized what his mentor had done. You're using their expectations against them, just like with Hawthorne's Gatling guns. Smart boy. The Dead Snake Gang expects either an armed camp or helpless victims. Instead, they'll find something that will make them question everything they believe about power and fear. As darkness fell, Grace gathered the community leaders in the church, not to plan a defense, but to ensure everyone understood their part in what was to come. Remember, he instructed, the real battle isn't for land or lives, but for minds and hearts. The Dead Snake Gang believes that fear is the strongest force in the world. Tonight, we prove them wrong. Eleanor watched her old friend closely. You're not going to draw your gun at all, are you? That's the beauty of it, Grace replied, patting his holstered Colt. I won't have to, because tonight it's not about being the fastest gun. It's about showing that a community united in peace is stronger than any force that relies on fear. As the hours ticked by and the Dead Snake Gang drew closer, Grace's plan began to take clearer shape. The bonfires weren't just for show. They created specific paths that would channel the gang's approach. The gathering crowds weren't random. They were positioned to demonstrate something that would shake the very foundation of what men, like Ortiz, believed about power. But what if they just start shooting? Someone asked. Grace's smile held that dangerous edge that reminded everyone he hadn't always been a peaceful farmer. Then they'll learn why we've spent months teaching everyone not just how to farm and trade, but how to work together. Why every building, every path, every gathering place has been carefully designed for more than one purpose. He turned to Maria. Reyes, his expression softening slightly. You asked if what we've built here could work in Sonora. Watch carefully tonight, because what you're about to see isn't just about defending one valley, it's about showing the world a new way to fight darkness without becoming dark ourselves. As the first scouts of the Dead Snake Gang reached the valley's edge, they found something none of their experience had prepared them for, and in that moment, Grace's greatest lesson about the true nature of power was about to be demonstrated in a way that would be remembered for generations to come. The Dead Snake Gangs. Scouts found something unprecedented as they crept into Redemption Valley that night. Instead of darkened buildings and fearful silence, they encountered what appeared to be a massive celebration. Bonfires blazed at regular intervals, their light revealing crowds of people, settlers, Apache and traders, all mingling together, as if they hadn't a care in the world. The sounds of music and laughter carried across the valley, but Grace, watching from the shadows of his porch, saw what others might miss. Every bonfire was positioned to create specific shadows and blind spots. Every gathering of celebrants included veterans of previous conflicts, positioned casually but strategically. Even the music served a purpose, making it harder for the gang to communicate quietly over distances. They're spreading out, Jamie reported, returning from his observation post. Just like you said they would, Grace nodded, noting how the gang's formation was already breaking down as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Confusion is like water, son. Once it starts flowing, it tends to follow the path of least resistance. The first real test came when a group of gang members, trying to maintain some semblance of their planned attack, attempted to take up positions near the trading post. They found themselves suddenly surrounded, not by armed defenders, but by a boisterous group of Apache and settler women, all talking and laughing as they went about their business. The women seemed completely unaware of the armed men, but their movements somehow always kept the gangsters off balance, unable to establish clear fields of fire without obviously threatening unarmed civilians. I don't understand, Maria Reyes whispered, watching from beside Grace. Why aren't they just shooting? Because La Vibra built his power on fear, Grace explained quietly. His men are used to people running away, hiding, giving them clear targets and obvious victims, but how do you terrorize people who act like you're not even worth noticing? Eleanor, who had positioned herself at the general store with a clear view of the main street, saw the genius of it. The gang members were being forced to either holster their weapons and blend in, becoming part of the celebration, or remain obviously hostile and increasingly foolish-looking in the face of such casual disregard. More gang members filtered in, and each group found themselves caught in similar situations. Some found themselves drafted into helping carry supplies between bonfires. Others were cheerfully but firmly directed to help set up tables for food. Each small interaction made it harder for them to maintain their image as fearsome raiders. Then, Manuel Ortiz himself rode in, his black horse and signature snakeskin vest making him instantly recognizable. He found Grace waiting in the middle of the main street, not in a gunfighter's stance, but simply standing there, unarmed except for his holstered Colt, calmly drinking coffee. "Interesting welcome," Ortiz called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of old Mexico mixed with something harder. Not what I expected from the famous ghost hand. "Coffee," Grace offered, holding up a second cup. "It's good stuff. Trading post blend, Apache beans roasted settler style. Amazing what people can create when they work together instead of against each other." Ortiz's face darkened, You mock me. I came here with 50 men. 47, Grace corrected mildly. 3 turned back at Shadow Canyon, deciding they'd rather try honest work at the new copper mines. Can't blame them. Steady pay, safe conditions, chance to build something instead of destroy it. Speaking of which, how's that working out for you? What? Destruction, fear, terror, keeping communities divided so you can prey on them more easily. Must be exhausting, always having to prove you're the biggest snake in the pit. Ortiz's hand drifted toward his gun. Careful, old man. Your reputation doesn't make you bulletproof. No, Grace agreed, but it does make me observant. Notice how your men are positioned, or rather, how they're not positioned anymore. For the first time, Ortiz seemed to really look around. His carefully planned formation had completely dissolved. Groups of his men were scattered throughout the celebration, most of them now holding plates of food instead of weapons, engaged in conversation with locals who seemed utterly unimpressed by their fearsome reputations. "What is this?" Ortiz demanded. "This," Grace replied, "is what happens when people stop being afraid. When they learn that the strongest community isn't the one with the most guns, but the one where everyone stands together. Look around you, Manuel. Really look. What do you see?" Ortiz did look, and what he saw seemed to shake him. Apache warriors chatting easily with settler women, army veterans sharing jokes with Mexican traders, children running between bonfires, completely unafraid of the armed men in their midst. And through it all, his own men being steadily absorbed into the celebration, their practiced menace melting away in the face of simple human connection. "Impossible," he muttered. "People are weak. They need strong men to..." "To what?" Grace's voice was gentle now. "To tell them who to fear, to keep them divided so they're easier to control. Look at your men, Manuel. Look how easily they've put aside their weapons when offered something better than fear to believe in." As if to emphasize his point, laughter erupted from nearby. One of Ortiz's most notorious lieutenants was attempting to learn a traditional Apache dance, much to the amusement of the gathered crowd. "You can't fight this," Grace continued, "not without becoming something even your own men would despise. But you can be part of it. That's the choice I'm offering you. The same choice I once offered Hawthorne, the same choice that transformed this valley. You can either be remembered as another snake in the pit, or as someone who helped build something better." Ortiz's hand had moved away from his gun, but his face showed he was still struggling with concepts foreign to his worldview. "And if I choose to fight anyway?" Grace's smile held no threat, but his eyes reminded everyone present that he hadn't earned his reputation by accident. "Then you'll learn why we spent months preparing this valley, not just for peace, but for any kind of trouble. Why every building, every gathering place, every friendly face you see is part of a defense so complete you haven't even noticed how thoroughly you've been contained." For the first time, Ortiz seemed to understand the true tactical situation. His men were not just scattered, they were positioned exactly where the townspeople wanted them, each group surrounded by layers of casual-seeming but carefully organized civilians. Any attempt at violence would be met not with terror, but with a coordinated response from all sides. 50 men against one town, Grace asked softly. Those odds might work when people are afraid, but against a community that stands together, who knows exactly how to support each other, those odds aren't in your favor, Manuel. They never were. Spring came early to Redemption Valley that year, bringing with it decisions that would echo far beyond its peaceful borders. The transformation of the Dead Snake Gang had become legend throughout the territory, how the fastest gun in the West had defeated 50 hardened outlaws without drawing his weapon once. But for Grace, it was just the beginning of a larger challenge. "You're really going to Sonora, aren't you?" Eleanor asked one morning, finding him on his porch, studying maps spread across a table. They weren't military maps or territory charts, but detailed drawings of communities, water sources, and trade routes. "Not alone," Grace replied, his eyes never leaving the maps. "And not as a ghost hand." Jamie, who had appointed himself Grace's permanent student, looked up from where he was cleaning his mentor's colt, a task Grace had entrusted to him more and more lately. "What do you mean, not alone?" Grace smiled, that patient smile that had become famous across the territory. "Look around, son. What do you see?" The boy surveyed the valley, taking in the mining operations where former outlaws worked alongside. Settlers, the trading posts where Apache scouts shared coffee with army patrols, the farms where different cultures had learned to grow food and trust together. "I see. People working together," Jamie said slowly. "But what does that have to do with Sonora?" "Everything." Grace stood, pointing to various marks on his maps. "The cartels maintain power by keeping communities isolated, dependent. They're not just criminal gangs, they're a system built on fear and division. You don't fight a system with guns. You fight it by building a better system." Manuel Ortiz, who had become a regular visitor to Grace's farm, stepped onto the porch. The former gang leader had changed in the month since the night of the celebration. His snakeskin vest was gone, replaced by practical working clothes, though he still moved with the careful grace of a man who understood both violence and its cost. "The cartels won't just let you walk in and start organizing people," Ortiz warned. "They have armies, politicians in their pockets, ways of making whole towns disappear." "Which is exactly why we don't try to fight them directly." Grace tapped specific points on the map. "We start here, here, and here. Small communities just like Redemption Valley was. We show them what you've learned, Manuel, that there's more profit in cooperation than conflict. We teach them what Maria Reyes already knows about healing divided communities." Eleanor understood first. "You're going to do exactly what you did here, create something they can't break because it's not held together by force." "But bigger," Grace nodded, "and with help from people who understand both sides of the border, both sides of the law. People who've learned that the strongest power isn't the power to destroy, but the power to build." Marshal Wade arrived as they were talking, leading his horse and carrying a packet of official-looking documents. "Just got word from territorial headquarters. They're expanding the trading post network all along the border. Armies on board too. Captain Wellington's been promoted to colonel, put in charge of a new kind of border patrol focused on protecting commerce instead of just chasing raiders." Grace took the papers, scanning them quickly. "And the Apache Council. Chief Black Horse says his people are ready. They've seen how the new system works, how it respects their rights while creating opportunities. They'll help establish similar arrangements with tribes on the Mexican side." The pieces were falling into place, just as Grace had planned. But this wasn't just about one man's vision anymore. Each person who had learned from Redemption Valley's example was becoming a teacher in their own right, ready to spread the lessons further. "The cartels will try to stop this," Ortiz warned again. "They'll send men like I used to be, try to terrorize people back into submission." "Good," Grace replied, surprising everyone. "Because when they do, they'll find something they don't expect. Not just one valley that stands together, but a whole network of communities ready to support each other. Traders who refuse to be intimidated because they know they're part of something larger. Farmers who understand that the best defense isn't a gun, but neighbors who stand with you." Jamie looked up from the colt he was cleaning. "But you'll still carry this, won't you, just in case?" Grace took the weapon, checking the action with practiced care before holstering it. "A gun's just a tool, son. Like any tool, it has its uses, but the fastest draw in the world can't build trust between people, can't create connections that make violence unnecessary. That takes a different kind of work, and different kinds of tools." As if to emphasize his point, riders were approaching from the south. More former gang members who had heard about what happened with the Dead Snake Gang. But they weren't coming to fight. They were coming to learn, to understand how their old skills could be turned to better purposes. Maria Reyes, who'd been quietly observing, finally spoke. "When do we leave?" 2 weeks, Grace replied. "Time enough to gather the right people, make sure everything here is solid. This valley taught us that peace isn't just about stopping violence. It's about building something strong enough to grow and spread on its own." Eleanor watched as more riders approached from different directions. Apache scouts, army patrol leaders, traders and settlers, all coming to be part of something larger than themselves. "You're not just taking people to Sonora," she realized. "You're proof that there's another way." "The best kind of proof," Grace agreed. "Living examples of how former enemies can become partners, how old hatreds can be transformed into new strengths. Every person who's learned these lessons becomes a seed that can grow in new soil." The next 2 weeks saw Redemption Valley bustle with preparation, but not the kind usually associated with a major operation. Instead of weapons being stockpiled or fighters being trained, knowledge was being shared, connections were being strengthened, and plans were being laid for expansion of the trading network. Grace spent much of his time not in tactical planning, but in ensuring that every part of the valley's success could be replicated elsewhere. He worked with Jamie and other young people, teaching them not just about defense and farming, but about the deeper principles that had transformed their community. "Remember," he told them during one lesson, "the cartels maintain power by making people believe they need strong men to protect them. We show them that real strength comes from working together, from building something that doesn't need protecting because everyone has a stake in its success." Manuel Ortiz, listening nearby, nodded in understanding. "Like what you did with my men. You didn't try to defeat us. You showed us a better way to be strong." "Exactly. And now you're going to help show others your experience, your understanding of how men like you used to think. That's more valuable than any gun could be." As the departure date approached, more unexpected allies arrived. Blackjack Hawthorne rode in with a group of reformed miners who had learned to work with both settlers and Apache. Representatives from the copper mining companies came with proposals for expanding legitimate commerce across the border. Even a few army deserters who had once run with the cartels arrived, seeking a chance to use their knowledge for something better. "You're building an army after all," Jamie observed one evening, watching the growing camp outside town. Grace shook his head. "Not an army, son. A community. Look closer. What do you see?" Jamie studied the gathered people with the careful attention his mentor had taught him. He saw former enemies sharing meals and stories, watched how different skills and knowledge were being exchanged freely. "I noticed how each person who arrived seemed to find their own way to contribute." "I see. Connections," he said finally, "like roots growing together." "Smart boy. An army moves by command, fights through force. But a community grows through understanding, strengthens through cooperation. That's what we're taking to Sonora. Not soldiers to fight the cartels, but seeds to grow something stronger than fear." Eleanor, who had been listening, stepped forward. "But you know there will be violence. The cartels won't just stand by and watch their power slip away." "There's always violence when old systems die," Grace agreed quietly. "But that's why we're bringing people who understand both sides, who can show others how to defend themselves without becoming what they're fighting against." He turned to Manuel Ortiz. "Tell them what you learned that night with the dead snake gang." Ortiz's face showed deep thought. "I learned that the strongest weapon isn't a gun or a knife or even fear itself. It's hope. When people see a better way is possible, when they understand they're not alone." He gestured at the gathering. "Look at my former men now. They're not following orders anymore. They're choosing to be part of something better." Maria Reyes joined them, her black dress now adorned with the colorful sash of a community healer. "The cartels understand only one kind of power," she said. "They think cutting off a head will kill the body. But what we're building is more like a field of wheat. Cut one stalk, and two more grow in its place. As the sun set over Redemption Valley, casting long shadows across the gathered people, Grace stood on his porch one last time. Tomorrow they would ride south, carrying not weapons of war, but tools of transformation. His hand rested lightly on his holstered Colt, not in preparation for violence, but as a reminder of how far he'd come from the days when being the fastest gun seemed like the answer to everything. "You've taught us well," Eleanor said softly. "The valley will be here when you return. That's the beauty of it," Grace smiled. "The valley isn't just this place anymore. It's an idea that's already spreading. Every person here carries a piece of what we built, ready to plant it in new soil." Jamie stepped forward, his young face serious. "When you come back, will you teach me to be as fast with a gun as you are?" Grace's answer surprised him. "No, son, I'll teach you something more valuable. How to make being fast with a gun unnecessary. How to build something so strong that violence becomes the least attractive."
Choice.
As darkness settled over the valley, the gathered people began sharing stories around their campfires, tales of how Redemption Valley had transformed them, of the lessons they'd learned about strength and peace and the power of standing together. Each story was a seed in itself, ready to take root in new ground. Tomorrow they would ride south, not as conquering heroes or righteous warriors, but as gardeners carrying hope to fertile soil. The fastest gun in the territory had learned that the quickest way to change the world isn't through the speed of a bullet, but through the steady growth of understanding and trust. And if sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, Grace's hand still checked his Colt with practiced care, it was no longer with the pride of a gunfighter, but with the wisdom of a man who had learned that the best weapons are the ones that never need to be drawn. The journey south into Sonora felt more like a trading caravan than a mission of change. Grace had deliberately arranged it that way, mixing wagons of legitimate goods with his people, establishing their presence as part of the natural flow of border commerce. But beneath the peaceful appearance, every member of the group understood they were riding into the heart of cartel territory. "First sign of trouble will be in Santo Cristo," Manuel Ortiz explained as they made camp on their third night. The former gang leader had traded his snakeskin vest for the practical clothes of a merchant, but his eyes still carried the sharp awareness of a man who knew danger. "It's a gateway town. Cartels control everything that moves through it." Grace nodded, studying the map spread before them in the firelight. "Tell me about the people there. Not the cartel soldiers, the townspeople. Merchants, farmers, mostly. Good people who've learned to keep their heads down. The cartels take half of everything they make. Protection money, they call it." Ortiz's face darkened with old memories. Those who refuse tend to disappear, and the local law. "Don Ramirez," Maria Reyes answered. "The police chief. He cooperates with the cartels because he thinks it's the only way to keep worse violence from happening to his people." Grace's eyes showed interest. A man who wants to protect his community, even if he's chosen the wrong way to do it. That's something we can work with. The next morning, as they approached Santo Cristo, Grace's careful preparation became apparent. The caravan had been arranged to look completely innocuous. Trading wagons up front, families in the middle, nothing that would trigger the cartel's suspicion. Former gang members like Ortiz had been positioned throughout, ready to speak the language of the streets if needed. The town itself was a study in fear's architecture. High walls surrounded the wealthier homes, while poorer districts huddled together as if for protection. Armed men lounged on street corners, their casual postures belying their watchful eyes. But Grace saw something else, something that made him smile, that quiet smile that had become famous in Redemption Valley. "Look there," he murmured to Jamie, who had insisted on coming despite his mother's concerns. "What do you see?" The boy studied the scene carefully, applying the lessons his mentor had taught him. The market square, People from different parts of town are mixing there, trading under the cartel's nose. And those children playing, they're from both rich and poor families, sharing the same games. Good eye. Even under the cartel's control, the community finds a way to grow. Those connections are like cracks in stone, perfect places for new seeds to take root. Their arrival drew the expected attention. Cartel soldiers approached the caravan, demanding inspection fees and protection payments. Grace had anticipated. This had prepared legitimate trading papers and exactly the right amount of money. Not so much as to seem suspicious, not so little as to cause trouble. But he'd also prepared something else. As the soldiers went through their practiced intimidation, they found themselves subtly separated, engaged in conversation by different members of Grace's group. Here, a former gang member would casually mention mutual acquaintances. There, a trader would discuss business opportunities. Each interaction was designed to create connections, to blur the lines between us and them. "You're not even trying to hide from them," Maria observed quietly. "Why? Should we?" Grace replied. "The cartels are used to dealing with people who either fight them openly or cower in fear. They don't know how to handle people who simply treat them as part of the community that needs to change." The real work began as they set up their trading stalls in the market. Grace's people spread out, not in military formation, but in the organic pattern of community growth he had perfected in Redemption Valley. Each person had their role, not assigned by command, but grown from their own strengths and knowledge. Former gang members like Ortiz focused on reaching out to the cartel soldiers, engaging them in conversations that subtly highlighted the differences between their current life and the possibilities of legitimate work. Traders demonstrated how profitable, honest commerce could be when communities worked together. And through it all, Grace moved quietly, watching, listening, identifying the key points where change could take root. The first real test came when Don Ramirez himself appeared in the market. The police chief was a heavy-set man with tired eyes and a carefully neutral expression, the look of someone who had spent years walking a dangerous line. "You're either very brave or very foolish," he said to Grace after studying the operation for several hours. "The cartels don't allow independent trading networks to develop. And yet here we are," Grace replied mildly, "bringing legitimate business to your town, offering opportunities for everyone to profit, including your officers, who I notice have been quite interested in our discussion of joint patrol methods along the trading routes." Ramirez's eyes narrowed. "You're the one they talk about, the gringo who turned Ghost Hand Grace into a farmer, the one who broke the dead snake gang without firing a shot." "Stories grow in the telling," Grace smiled. "But tell me, Chief Ramirez, what do you see when you look at your town? Not what the cartels let you see, but what you know is there, waiting for a chance to grow." The question seemed to catch Ramirez off guard. He looked around the market square, seeing the subtle changes that had already begun. Cartel soldiers chatting with traders about legitimate job opportunities. Local merchants cautiously discuss cooperation with the newcomers. Children playing freely near stalls that bridged the usual social divides. "I see danger," he said finally. "Hope is dangerous in a place like this. It makes people take risks, makes them forget their place." "Their place?" Grace's voice was gentle but firm. "Look at what treating people like they have a place has brought. Fear, poverty, young men turning to violence because they think it's their only choice. But what if there was another way? What if the very things the cartels use to maintain control, money, power, influence, could be turned to building something better?" Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.